itself. We're also going to provide is it recording? A link of the recording. I know that we maxed out, we hit our capacity, and I know there were a lot of other people just simply weren't able to make the time. So do spread the word that this will be available on the website. Excuse me. So yeah, as I said, I'm Barb Perry. I am the director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism, and a faculty member in social science humanities at Ontario Tech University. I've sort of worked in the area broadly of hate studies for more years than I'm going to admit to, and mostly in hate crime, but in more recent years, the last 7 or 8 years, developing some expertise around right-wing extremism in the Canadian context. I'm also the co-lead of the network, and really excited by the multiple projects I think that are going to come out of this network. My co-director or co-lead for the network is Dr. David Hofmann, who you see. He's an associate professor of sociology at University of New Brunswick and a research fellow with the Gregg Center for the Study of War and Society, as well as a senior research affiliate with the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security, and Society, which most of you will know as TSIS. David's current research interests are focused on 5 broad areas: terrorism and political violence, charismatic leadership, right-wing extremism, apocalyptical and millenarian, these are tough words to say, and criminal and illicit networks. David is a mixed methodologist with a particular interest in social network analysis. His recent funded research is related to terrorist risk and threat assessment, charismatic leadership within terrorist groups, the far right and anti-government movements in Canada, hate crimes in Canada and the Maritimes, and modeling the fragmentation of trafficking networks upon removal of key actors and leaders. We also have with us today Marc Imbeault, who is an associate professor at RMC, currently pursuing research in the field of politics and ethics, with particular attention to counterterrorism, naval strategy, and command. Mr. Imbeault is member of the United States Naval Institute, Inter-University Seminar on Armed Forces and Society, and pardon my French, Association Internationale de Pédagogie Universitaire, and of the Canadian Philosophical Association. And we also have with us Murray Brewster, who is a senior defense writer with CBC News. He's covered the Canadian military and foreign policy from Parliament Hill for over a decade. Among other assignments, he spent a total of 15 months on the ground covering the Afghan war for the Canadian press. Prior to that, he covered defense issues and politics for CP in Nova Scotia for 11 years and was bureau chief for Standard Broadcast News in Ottawa. So that is our slate today. And with no further ado, I am going to let David lead off here, introducing the network.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me all right? I'm having trouble with my mic, or at least I was when I was lecturing yesterday. So thumbs up if you can hear me, at least the panelists. If you're not a panelist, I can't see your thumb, so I apologize. So thank you, Dr. Perry. As Dr. Perry, my colleague, mentioned, I'm David Hofmann. I'm an associate professor at the University of New Brunswick and co-lead for the RWE-CAF network. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to the nuts and bolts of what the network is about and who is part of the network. So if you can move to the next slide, please, Barb. So when we started this project in mid-2020, the goal here was to create a national network that is represented not only by scholars who, myself and Barb and a team that we surround around ourselves. The idea here was to create hubs and a truly national network in scope. So we have every portion of Canada, aside from the territories, represented by network members and hubs. With myself in the Maritimes, Dr. Perry and Dr. West in Ontario. In Quebec, Dr. Campana and Dr. Tanner. Out west, we have Dr. Davies. We also have affiliates who are part of OPV, the oh my God, I'm drawing a blank on the acronym. So many acronyms, especially with the military. But our colleagues, Dr. John McCoy, Dr. King, and Dr. Jones out in Alberta. We also have a postdoctoral fellow who's been hired to work with us, Dr. Philip McChrystal, and we essentially have put together the network and begun, as Barb mentioned, with rigorous data collection and a scan of the literature. And over the coming years, we're going to release as much empirically grounded research in the area as possible. So I will spare you me reading out these questions. There's nothing worse than having someone, infantilize you by reading what's on the slide in front of you. But the idea here is we're tackling the question of right-wing extremism in the Canadian Armed Forces from many different angles. We are interested in it from a broad, or at least at the beginning, we're interested in it from a broad open source, quantitative approach where we're gathering as much open source data as we can. But as the network grows and as the network continues to engage in projects, OPV, yeah, sorry, Tracy just posted in chat, Organization Prevention of Violence, OPV. I'm terrible with acronyms. How embarrassing. Anyways, the idea here is we're going to narrow our focus as we proceed, starting broad with some of the quantitative stuff, and proceeding with interviews with CAF members, veterans, people who are knowledgeable about the CAF and the RWE aspects within the CAF, but aren't necessarily serving members. And we're going to tackle and try and answer a number of questions about essentially the nuts and bolts of the who, what, when, where, and why behind RWE, how it is manifested in the Canadian Armed Forces, how it spreads, and who is doing the spreading, and so on and so forth. And also looking at it from a group perspective as well. So which right-wing extremist groups out there are particularly interested in members, in recruiting, in attracting, or in sending members of their organizations into the Canadian Armed Forces for a variety of reasons. Can you move forward, please, Barb?
That was it.
Is this where you're taking over, or?
Yeah, unless there's something else you wanted to say about the research, maybe the methodologies.
Yes, sorry. I apologize for that. So as I mentioned, we're not only starting broad and we're going narrow. We're going to, as I mentioned, we're gathering quantitative statistical data. We're going to be engaged in qualitative approaches, which are one-to-one interviews with, again, people who can elucidate and illuminate on the RWE phenomenon in the Canadian Armed Forces. There's also myself and Garth Davies and several of the other members of the network who have expertise in social network analysis. And we're hoping to gather good relational data to put together and examine sociometric measurements involved with the types of networks that right-wing extremists might build within the Canadian Armed Forces, or who, how they connect with other organizations within and other individuals within and without or outside of the Canadian Armed Forces. Did I miss any of the methods there, Barb?
And survey methodology.
And survey, I apologize. Yeah, we're going to send out a survey, which we are on the end stages of designing and releasing through the CAF itself, which will get us some decent primary source data on RWE within the CAF.
Good. Okay. Thanks, David, for that introduction. I just wanted to sort of situate our work, as David has suggested. We're at very early stages. We just submitted our REB, and those of you who are, have research in this area know that's going to take us a while to, especially in this sensitive topic, to sort of get all the way through that REB process. So yeah, we've been doing a lot of that open source data gathering at this point. But just to sort of situate the work that we're doing in the broad broader context. I just wanted to share with you, sort of how we've been understanding the far right movement in the Canadian context. And this is sort of the typology that we are developing, looking at the diversity of the movement. I think that that's really important because different elements, different strands of the movement have different propensities for promotion of violence or for engaging in violence themselves. Obviously, there are different ideological strands that animate different elements of the movement. So I thought that was really important to highlight at the outset, that this sort of looks like it's a multi-tentacled beast that we're talking about here. It's not homogeneous. They look different in terms of presentation of self, in terms of the uniform, and in terms of the indicators like tattoos and symbology and all of that. So I thought really important to lay that out first of all. It's interesting because in 2015, when Ryan Scrivens and I published our first report on far right extremism in Canada broadly, it was our typology was pretty narrow. It was sort of the white supremacists, skinheads, neo-Nazis, lone actors, and anti-authority. And the movement has morphed considerably in the years since then, since 2015, so that there's, the accelerationists like the base Adam Waffen have come to the fore. Explicitly anti-Muslim groups have emerged. Misogynistic groups, the manosphere, have emerged. Of course, the alt-right has sort of hit the ground running after the Trump election in particular. And perhaps most worrying, along with the accelerationists, is a dramatic increase in the patriot or the militia movement in the Canadian context. And I say most worrying because these two elements are most likely to promote and engage in violence. They're often heavily armed, and they're also amongst those who are most likely to actively recruit from military and law enforcement personnel as well. So that sort of leads to this notion of why we're embarking on this particular piece of work, why we're looking at the engagement of military personnel with the far right movement. And there are a number of issues that have come to the fore in recent years. One is the very explicit claims amongst those who are in the movement already that they in fact do boast about having membership from military personnel, current as well as a former military personnel, and again, law enforcement personnel as well. So they're very explicit about that. Lemut, for example, which is a group based in Quebec, was actually founded by two former military personnel and was established to replicate in some ways the structure, the military structure, the hierarchy, the same sorts of labels or titles for functionaries within the movement, that sort of piece, so that there was a good fit for military personnel coming into that particular group. We've also seen evidence of, active recruitment by some of these groups within the military. And I think the example of Patrick Matthews, which is noted further down, was a good example of that. That was recruitment from within, but he was also actively recruited as a recruiter. So recruited to recruit, if you will. We also see some indication that groups encourage their members to enlist, even if just in the reservist rather than in regular service, to get some of that training that they think will be useful to the movement come the revolution from their perspective. So there is that active outreach, as well as encouragement of people to gain that valuable experience. We also saw a report in 2018, an internal report that identified 53 CAF members as affiliated or associated in some way with hate groups and or with hate crime. And I think they even identified at that point that was probably the tip of the iceberg. So we sort of wanted to do a deep dive around that. We've also, of course, seen some really high profile cases over the past few years, and you can see some of them here and the connections, the engagement that they've had with different elements of the movement as well. And so that really is cause for concern, not just in terms of the immediate threat that they represent, but also I think sort of the public optics as well. These are the cases that were very highly publicized, and I think have led to questioning by the general public. So I think important to respond to that. And then the last piece, and this has come out of some of the American scholarship, which is quite a ways ahead of our own, where they seem to be seeing that the presence of military personnel or former military personnel within particular groups actually enhances the likelihood of them engaging in violence. So, and that is ideologically motivated extremist violence. So I think that's sort of another reason. I mean, many more, but these are really the highlights or the lowlights that have drawn us into this particular work. We're also thinking about the various points of engagement, some of which I mentioned in passing when I was talking about those causes for concern, if you will. So we're really looking at those who were engaged prior to joining the military. Sort of how did they slip through the cracks? Why are they coming to the military? As I said, is it to gain that access to weapons? Is it to gain the training, or is it so that they can enhance the recruitment efforts from within? We're looking at engagement during service, the extent to which people are recruited while in service, whether actively recruited or whether mobilized through perhaps their online activities, through gaming or chat rooms or other social media venues. We're also very interested, of course, in engagement after service. That is the explicit recruitment, or even just the slow gradual creep into far-right extremism of people who have left the military. And because we know from the American experience, we know from the events of January 6th, for example, that in the US context, there are an awful lot of veterans drawn to the movement. Is that the case here? If it is, why is that? What is shaping that vulnerability? One of the other pieces, and thinking back to the description of the network, in addition to the postdoc fellow that's associated with this particular network, we also have a postdoc fellow on a Minds Targeted Engagement grant who is more policy based, looking at the policy arena within the context of the CAF. So, sort of assessing the recent orders that have been and directives that have been implemented, but also thinking about, what kinds of policy responses or what kinds of policy mechanisms that are already in place might also be applied in this context, or what are some of our partner nations doing? How are they responding to far-right extremism? So trying to hash out some policy directions that can, I think, sort of surround and support those concrete policies and directives noted here. And I think that's about it for us, laying the foundation of the work that we intend to do. So I see, we've got some folks from CAF and DND in the audience, so we might be knocking on your doors at some point in the future. So again, I thank you for your interest in that. I'm going to turn the stage, if you will, now over to Marc Imbeault to tell us a little bit about what his observations have been and the research that he's been doing in this area as well.
So thank you, Barbara. Sure. First of all, I have to say that I will not talk for the CAF, but only as a researcher. Since the topic is sensitive, especially at this time. And can I control the PowerPoint? Oh, yes, okay. I'll begin with a few words on Jean-François Lyotard. Many years ago, I was listening to the philosopher Lyotard, and he was talking about a non-exposition on non-objects. And I was astonished, asking myself, how can we organize a non-exposition on non-objects? And as you know, Jean-François Lyotard is a postmodern philosopher, and he meant that the non-objects were completely symbolic. They doesn't really exist. That's what he said, or something like that. So today, I will not make exactly the same thing, but I must admit that my topic is on a not a perfectly well-defined object. So let's begin. You will see what I mean. So the question is, what is already known about the prevalence of right-wing extremism in the Canadian Armed Forces? First, from the point of view of research, nothing is done yet specifically on right-wing extremism prevalence internally. We have preliminary data that we have collected. For example, at RMC Saint-Jean, where the CFIR conducted interviews before the COVID crisis began. But the analysis of this material is ongoing. And there is other work that is done at the same time elsewhere. But we don't have any research, true research right now. Second, we have a lot of research on behaviors you might associate with that kind of ideology. We have over 30 years of survey looking at harassment and discrimination within the CAF. Although we have seen a decline in the reported rates of harassment across the organization, we still see consistently racialist members, indigenous members, and women reporting higher rates than other groups. We also have a lot of data on abuse of power. Of the types of harassment measured, abuse of power tends to be the one that is reported among the most, and again, tends to be reported at higher rates by some of these minority groups. Maybe this is a clear indication of the existence of extremism or the existence of a climate or a context within the CAF. Nevertheless, the numbers are not so high. You might have on a self-reported survey, 15% of respondents saying they have experienced or have witnessed some form of harassment. In the past, measures of hazing, for example, were always exceptionally low. Other forms of harassment based on racial identity or sexual orientation can reach higher numbers, depending on the area or the group you are talking about. That gave us a sense of where we are, with the extent to which people are reporting behaviors that might be linked to extremism. But we should not establish too rapidly a direct link between these numbers and the prevalence of right-wing extremism in the CAF. It is only examples we can point to say it is not impossible, it is dangerous, and we have to investigate. Third, in general, most of our focus was on measuring individual behaviors and experience. There has not been a lot of research at a systems level. Right now, we are hearing a lot about the need to tackle systemic discrimination, but we do not have a lot of evidence. There are some examples. As an example, there were concerns over the CAF aptitude test, and that Indigenous applicants were disadvantaged because there was a bias in the test. CAF specialists studied the test and found that there was evidence of potential bias that would disadvantage Indigenous applicants. And so they are now correcting the test. That is something that we can say is more of a systemic issue as opposed to an individual behavior. But largely speaking, the research over the years has been focusing on individual level experience. A lot of qualitative work has been made, talking with minority groups about their service experience, the types of barrier encountered, and some of whom have reported back and said, yes, I have experienced latent or ambiguous forms of racism. A member said, for example, he knew one of his peers might be associating with La Meute in the province of Quebec. So there is an awareness among the members that this is something that is happening. But on the research side, we really just getting started. the CAF has been mostly focused on putting in place policy response. For example, the recruiting group members are trained to recognize signs that could point to a potential recruit belonging or affiliation with groups that do not share CAF values. Indications of hateful beliefs or activities disqualify applicants from enrollment into the CAF. There already was quite a lot in place upon tattoos, for example. So, if the question is, what do we know about the prevalence of right-wing extremism in the CAF? I must admit that we know, essentially by the media, that there is an issue, and we know that it affects people. And this will be my conclusion. But to measure the magnitude, how big the problem is, we are just getting there now. So we are just at the beginning. We don't really know the magnitude of the problem. So the importance of a project like this one is relevant, absolutely relevant. And I hope that research will help us having a better idea of the magnitude of the problem, and then adjust the policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Marc. I think it's equal parts disturbing and reaffirming. Disturbing, we don't know more, but it I think reinforces our commitment to the project. So thank you for that. And Murray, over to you now. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Barbara. Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to be able to join you today. And I sincerely hope I'm not going to be too much of a disappointment, because I don't have a great deal of research to be able to present to you. And therefore, there's going to be no PowerPoint presentation. My remarks are going to be reasonably short, because essentially what I'd like to do is to be able to give you some insight and perspective on the media coverage of right-wing extremism in the Canadian military. I will say that it is an issue that has taken many longtime defense reporters and even reporters who do general assignment by surprise. I don't think that many in the Canadian media were alive to the possibility of right-wing extremism, infiltration, influence in the Canadian military until July 2nd of last year, July 2nd, 2020. The turning point was the incident at Rideau Hall involving Corey Hearn. And even then, it took a couple of days for his associations, for some of his history to come to the surface. I will say that some of that is probably related to COVID and the inability of media organizations to move around more freely. And I mean, newsrooms are empty right now. I'm not sure if you realize how almost, you can see it on television, but even in print, most reporters are working from home. And so I would suggest that prior to July 2nd of last year, coverage of this was scattershot. We had an incident here. And we had the Patrick Matthews case. We had, I mean, going back to 2017, we had the Proud Boys, but these were seen. These seem to be one-offs, at least, and I'm speaking strictly from the media perspective. And I think the perception was that right-wing extremism and right-wing, perhaps potential right-wing influence in the military was more an American phenomenon. And I would also suggest that in terms of coverage, and this is not restricted to the CBC, this is CTV, this is many of the other Canadian media organizations, we were simply transfixed with the events in the United States. And I don't want to say ignoring, but perhaps blissfully unaware of some of the spillover that that was taking place. And but Rideau Hall certainly focused the media's attention. And when I say focused media attention, it wasn't the incident itself, but it prompted many news organizations, including our own, to begin thinking more deeply about it, about the issue, and to actually put editorial resources behind looking into the issue, especially when it became apparent that Corey Hearn had a military background. And I mean, I can only speak from the point of view of the CBC. We put a small team together, and we began by looking into the unit that Corey Hearn was a part of, because we were hearing, and myself and another colleague were hearing rumblings about what was going on in the unit and some perceptions, etc. And that led our coverage to Master Corporal Eric Miglin and his wife, and some of the anti-government posts, and the fact that he was an active recruiter for both the 3% movement and for the Soldiers of Odin. By the way, the investigation into the 4th Canadian Ranger Patrol Group is complete. You will probably see a story in the next couple of days about it and what the findings are. I can't tip my hand and tell you what it is ahead of time because I'd be scooping myself. But it was a matter of actually focusing attention and beginning to put not only investigative resources behind and looking into the issue and connecting some of the dots, but it was also a matter of putting, when I say editorial resources, putting an editorial emphasis on this and raising this as a public policy issue that needs to be addressed, and putting pressure on not only the Canadian Army but other branches of the Canadian military to pay attention to this, and as well the Department of National Defense. And as you know, the Department of National Defense has established a panel that is looking into right-wing extremism and racism in the military. And the panel is yet to really get going, but at least in terms of public response to some of our queries. But it is an issue, I think, that, and I've heard from the other presentations, that academically, from a policy and from a political perspective, people are just coming to grips with whether there is a problem and the extent of the problem. And I think the same is true for the media at the moment. We are trying to wrap our heads around how big is this problem, and and more importantly, what are its origins? And so, to that end, I would suggest to you that there are some things that my colleagues and I have learned from this first go round that are going to have to be applied not only to our further investigations and the further inquiries that we make about this, but I guess it should be considered writ large across the media, because studying and trying to wrap our hands around right-wing extremism in the military is very difficult, and a lot of the organizing, a lot of the activity, a lot of the chatter is online. And as we all know, social media is an amplifier. It may not necessarily be a true representation of the extent of the problem. And if there is some of the lessons learned that we have taken from our investigation of the 4th Ranger Patrol Group has been that we have to begin any investigation by building better databases, and being able to study these groups and their activities a lot more closely, track individuals and their online activity more closely and carefully, and document it. That was one of the more extraordinary aspects of our investigation in the fall of last year, was that we had to build these databases, and we had to begin seeing some of the patterns and who was talking to whom. And that is not something that the modern media is, with the exception of very few news organizations, able to do very effectively. I could give you a very long lecture about the current state of the media and the near total collapse of the beat system and the absence of specialization right now that all newsrooms are suffering through. But what I'd like to focus my remarks on is that there are a few select media organizations that do have the horsepower to be able to look into this. One of them is the CBC. There are other media organizations, and those organizations are turning their attention towards this. And then finally, I would suggest that journalists who are covering this are going to have to become more sophisticated in terms of their research, in terms of their ability to be able to spot and identify some of the different markers that are present with these groups, and also begin to expand their, and this is a personal observation, begin to expand their view of not only just the CAF, and that this is a problem, a potential problem with just the CAF, as we saw with the Capitol riot in the United States in January of this year. It is a problem in the veterans community. And I think that is not only an area of study for academics, but it is also an area where the media has to begin to explore. And I'll tell you, that is something that I have been advocating within the CBC as we begin planning our editorial coverage going forward, because I think that this is an important unexplored aspect of this. So I hope I haven't bored you too much. Those are my remarks, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that, Murray. I think, yeah, there's plenty of work to be done all around, you know, as you said at the outset, from policy perspective, academic, and from a media and public awareness perspective as well. So I look forward to collaborations with you down the road on these important questions. So I think we have a couple of questions in the Q&A forum. So I'm just going to, can everyone see them or can only we see them? I'm going to just read them out, and whoever would like to can respond. Can or do we separate inquiries into right-wing extremism in the CAF from broader conversations related to diversity and inclusion within the military institution? If you do plan to address the broader question of diversity and inclusion in your research, how will you do this? David, do you want to take a stab?
Sorry, I was halfway through typing out an answer.
No.
And I just want to draw attention that the one I answered already is not in the open, it's in the answer, but we can discuss that in further detail. That's a good question. And it's a hard one to answer this early on in the process. If we, what we're really trying to do is understand whether or not we should devote our resources and our energy to broader conversations like this. In short, the idea here is we're trying to figure out the hot button topics, and by no means am I saying diversity and inclusion is not a hot button and an important topic, but the types of right-wing extremism that this network and the various researchers are involved in, I would dare say we're looking at the more virulent and more potentially violent form of extremism, as opposed to the more insidious and I hate to say it, but more normative forms of systemic and personal forms of racism and bias and that individuals within the CAF might have. So I'm not saying that we aren't interested in conversations related to diversity and inclusion, but it is something that's not in our immediate crosshairs. Barb, anything you want to add?
Well, I think they're mutually reinforcing, and that, you know, that sort of culture of bias that has been uncovered in terms of sexual misconduct, for example, and, you know, the incidents of harassment or the survey results around harassment, those sorts of things. You know, those are pieces that shape the environment in which right-wing extremism can also thrive. And then the presence of right-wing extremism sort of legitimates and amplifies, I think, those sentiments. So I think they are inseparable. And particularly in the policy context, I mean, that was almost our starting point, was to look at policies in some of those other areas, and were they up to the task of dealing with, you know, the more extreme manifestations of hatred and hostility in terms of right-wing extremism and other forms of hateful conduct. And I think that, you know, the fact that now there are directives specifically to this area are an indicator that, you know, the existing tools were not up to the job. So, you know, they are mutually inclusive. I mean, you know, the broader questions of inclusivity and inclusion, exclusion are, you know, not necessarily the focus of the research, but are always going to be part of the environment.
Also much more eloquent, not to put down my own answer, but that's a much more eloquent answer.
No, just a different answer. The next two questions, I really wish that Phil were here. Is Phil in the audience? I don't think Phil had joined us.
I was halfway,
today.
I was typing that out in the answer. You know,
Yeah.
Dr. McChrystal can answer this much better. I have been having conversations with him though, on some work we're doing mutually. So I can channel his spirit to a certain degree when it comes to answering the Somalia incident, but he is the expert there, unless he is in the audience and would like to indicate that.
I don't think he is here. I was just looking through the participants. No, so go ahead.
So there's several questions about Somalia incident. So I'll start with the first one. Building on someone's concerns about discriminatory actions against enemy combatants in the public chat, can we see the Somalia affair as an RWE attack If so, what are some of the lessons that the military and academic analysts can and should take from that atrocity? And again, Dr. McChrystal and I are working on a piece of I guess, reflexive or I guess reflexive is the best word, research that looks at the history of right-wing extremism in Canada and what we should be doing and what we should be informing ourselves from these previous lessons. And the first thing that this conversation with Dr. McChrystal really shocked me was that there's multiple cases prior to the Somali affair that can be classified as right-wing extremist in nature or in spirit. However, in terms of the Somali affair as a watershed moment for the CAF, it is absolutely I guess the pivotal moment, the wake-up moment for the lack of a better term, for modern right-wing extremist scholars and for the CAF itself to, it basically woke people up to a certain degree. As Murray mentioned, it was last year that was the big wake-up moment for the Canadian media. The Somali affair and the inquiries that followed were essentially started this conversation. Nothing, and again, as Marc mentioned, nothing concrete has really happened, but it at least put the issue on the radar. So is it a right-wing extremist attack? Yes. What we know about the airborne regiment and the people involved in this, I mean, it was racially motivated, and it started this reflexive awareness to a certain degree. In terms of the lessons that the military and academic analysts should take from the Somali incident, well, in Canada, we like to, as Barb mentioned, and as Murray mentioned, we like to think that we are either immune or the realities of the American military and right-wing extremism can't affect us, or something similar can't affect us here in Canada. I mean, this is something that has been an issue for decades prior to now, but really has only come to the forefront now. And I think we're starting to wake up, at least the analysts are, and absolutely the CF is starting to wake up in terms of what is in the army, or what the consequences of not better understanding this phenomenon might have on the CAF in terms of a legitimacy issue and a public awareness issue. Anyways, and yeah, the next question was, how can analysts today retroactively recognize or code RWE activities in the longer term past? Difficult. We mostly are relying on open source data for this, which is imperfect because not everything is coded, not everything is brought to the forefront. There's a whole dark world or dark body of data that is not available to us, and so we only get a sliver of the picture. Historical approaches like ones Dr. McChrystal is taking are important and will shed further light on this. And this something should be published in this area, hopefully in the next year or so, and will be posted to, obviously, the network's website. I'm monopolizing too much time here.
Actually, so. I just got I'm looking in chat, and Phil is actually here. So
awesome.
Phil, I'm going to allow you to talk. So if you want to respond to that.
I can stop talking for him.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thanks, Phil.
Okay, so and I agree with all the panelists with what's being said, with Marc basically stating that that the issue is not well defined, and which then ties into Mr. Brewster's thoughts with regards to the fact that we have to look at areas that haven't really been considered an area to look at, such as veterans. but there's the issue of surveillance and how do we actually approach the issue. Right now we're looking at open sources, but definitely it is an issue as far as looking more discreetly into the issue. But I mean, as far as right-wing extremism goes in the military, I mean, it dates back to the early 90s with Eckler Fisher and Eric Fisher, for instance, and with regards to the Somalia event. I mean, Matt McKay has been zeroed in on two different occasions prior to the 1993 event, and then following the 1993 event. So it's just that we haven't been looking at the problem. So the fact that it's now being illuminated that there is an issue, maybe we can now zero in on some of these dated cases and tie them together. One of the things that I find that is missing is tying these individuals and the elements in which they serve, and how they connect to the bigger issue. I mean, is it a sort of looking at individuals from um, where they enroll as far as the element that they enroll in? I mean, Patrick, if you look at, for instance, let me see here. Hold on a second. Just bear with me here. If you look at Patrick Matthews, for instance, he served with the engineers out west. So is it a combat element issue where individuals are being recruited from the combat arms, or is it more of the logistical side of things where they're not being looked at that closely because they're not sort of situated in a combat role? I don't know. Those are areas that still need to be explored. But I do agree with all the panelists and what has been said. It is definitely an area that needs to be more defined. And any questions? I don't know if you have any questions, but please feel free.
Thanks, Phil. I appreciate that. I think we're going to move on to the next question. How can people currently serving in the military address the difference between those holding views of what I would term legitimate right-wing viewpoints and those who hold RWE views? Oh, it just jumped. Or is this going to have to be a case-by-case basis? David, I see a note you were going to answer. Did you want to respond there?
That's something that I kind of alluded to with one of the previous remarks here, and it's something I mention very often when doing media interviews and people who are questioning the scope and goals of the type of research we're doing. And what we're trying to be very careful about in our research is avoiding what's called a net widening effect. So this means we have to be very careful with our definitions, with what we term legitimate or non-legitimate right-wing viewpoints, what a pro-social conservative values versus potentially violent right-wing values, and so on and so forth. And this is something we have discussed internally and is a large part of how we define right-wing extremism and what the goals of the network are. And ultimately, obviously, we don't want to include individuals who hold pro-social, legal, and it's their absolute right to hold conservative values in a Western liberal democracy. And those aren't the people we're interested in. What we're interested in are the hallmark behaviors and hallmarks of right-wing ideologies that, and we can provide our definition, and we have provided our definition in various publications. But the idea here is, are they a threat to public safety, public security, minority groups, or are they? Is there a propensity or very real possibility of violence associated with these ideologies? That's the line in the sand that we're drawing, and again, to avoid this net widening effect.
Yeah, and just to follow up there, it's sort of what I've been calling what we're concerned about is dangerous speech, right? It's not just speech that's harmful or, offensive. Sorry, not just speech that's offensive or hurts someone's feelings, but that has the real potential for damage. And David, you used the term hallmarks. Well, there was a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal case that identified the 11 hallmarks of hate that separate out hate speech from free speech. And I don't, it's not a thin line. It's not a blurry line at all. For me, it is, a quite explicit line that the courts have drawn in the sand, as you said, David, in defining and determining what constitutes hateful and dangerous speech. And I think Murray wants to chime in there.
Yeah, I do, just for 1 second, Barbara, because this came up during our investigation of the 4th Canadian Ranger Group, and a number of people I spoke with in uniform expressed not a similar notion, but it's basically, look, how do you separate normal, like, conservative, right wing or right leaning tendencies with what you're seeing, and that's something that we grappled with, what is the line? And you correctly and very eloquently identified one of the lines, and that is hate speech. And there's the other line. But for members of the Canadian military, there is another line that is not necessarily commonly understood, and that is the fact that when you sign on the dotted line, you are essentially serving the whole country. And you have to, as much as you may have your own personal beliefs, that's fine, but you don't bring them to work, and you certainly don't express them in uniform, because that is a reflection upon the integrity of the uniform. And while everyone has their own view, everyone has political views, and this is something goes back time immemorial. But I suggest to you that the filter that may have been there years before has been lost because of social media, where people feel that they can necessarily say anything that they want, and it's their God-given right to be able to say something, and this is my view, and that's it. And I mean, and folks in the military are absolutely no different than the rest of us and the rest of Canadians. But there is a certain degree of responsibility when you wear a uniform that goes with free speech. And it's not that you have to check your brain or your views, but you certainly have to temper them in public. And that was something that we wrestled with in trying to investigate this, because separating legitimate criticism of the government and with something that is more odious and not on. And I think that this is an area that requires more academic research, but also within the Canadian military, much more in the way of not training, but certainly laying down like markers. Now, folks in the Reg Force, I think they understand that, but I can tell you that is something that folks in the reserve units, where people straddle the civilian and the military world, this is something that has to be reinforced. At least this has been something that has come to our attention, and myself and the other folks that worked on those pieces. And it's a very live and it's a very important issue, because folks in the military, they're there to defend democracy, and democracy is about a diversity of opinion and a diversity of views. And one of the arguments that I used to hear from folks in the military was, well, we can't check our brains, and we're not going to check our views at the door. No, but you certainly have to be there to represent all Canadians. And I think that's something that needs to be better defined and more clearly understood.
Thanks for that, Murray. I think that's a really important point, and something that we've had conversations with, again, internally and with with D&D as well is that whole question of, folks in the military are held to a different standard because they have, I was just talking to the German military attaché this morning, and they were referring to the German project, which is called Citizen in Uniform. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective and something we can learn from. The next question, and Phil, was that the one I was going to go to next? Did I miss one? No, I'm glad you're with us, Phil, because I think maybe you are best apt to respond to this question. How do you see the link between right-wing extremism and sexual misconduct in the CAF and the correlations with abuse of power? Should they be addressed separately, or are they part of a bigger issue? I know that's something that you've given a lot of thought to.
Can you still hear me okay?
Yeah.
I think they're interrelated. I think that one is more insidious than the other, and one is more, I guess, the behavior within that culture and what's manifested within that culture there seems to be certain things that are more accepted, more condoned than the other. I think sexual misconduct and so on, although is obviously inappropriate and so on, it is more of a common behavior than right-wing extremist behavior and hateful behavior. So, but I think they are related. Those as far as discrimination goes and so on. I think that right now everything is coming to light. It's coming out of the woodwork. So I guess it's going to be a matter of time before we actually figure all of this out. But definitely, leadership is an issue, accountability is an issue, and then let's start reading in between the lines. Let's start looking at more discrete behavior that's occurring and sort of putting our thumb on it.
Okay, thanks, Phil. The next question, has there been any data collected on the ratio of right-wing extremist individuals who join the forces versus if they're radicalized recruited after training? Also, is there any sort of programs that the CAF already has in place to combat this issue, or will that come down in recommendations through this initiative? And David, it looks like you wanted to take that one on.
I can answer part of it, and feel free, Barb, to chime in as necessary, obviously. But the quick answer is not yet. What we do know, though, is we don't know internally whether individuals are radicalized or recruited, well, at least the numbers or the processes after joining. What we do know, though, is the chatter from the right-wing groups themselves, which clearly indicates, as Barb mentioned early on in the presentation, particularly from the Patriot and the American-style militia movements here in Canada, there is an absolute fascination with the CAF as a source of knowledge, as a location to obtain said knowledge, and a potential location to obtain materiel for whatever accelerationist plan they might have, or whatever their long-term apocalyptic or revolutionary plans are. I also I borrow a term from a piece of terrorism literature called jihadi cool. There's also a fascination within these right-wing extremist groups that I call military cool, where there's a form of social capital associated with individuals who have previous military training, and they're put up on a social pedestal within these groups, not only for the practical knowledge that they might bring, but these are individuals who can teach and it's, think of it as like the big brother kind of taking the wimpy little brother under their wing and showing them how the real world is and so on and so forth. That's associated with even tangential association with the military. So we know there's a draw, a one-way draw from the groups themselves, and that there's been efforts to send members to join the CAF. We don't know, again, the extent of individuals who are radicalized or recruited after training, and something that will be difficult to properly assess, but it's something that we hope to be able to analyze when we start gathering primary data with the CAF itself. I can't answer the initiative portion with any authority, though.
Marc, go ahead.
Yes, there is many initiatives within the CF against that kind of ideology under different umbrella. Ethics, there's a ethics program. Within that program, officers, non-commissioned members have training, education on Canadian value, on the Department of Defense statement of ethics, how to apply it, what is not compatible with it. So there is a lot, I would say. And on harassment, there's a lot of training and education on these topics. And on this point, if I can add a word with regard to the veteran, in Lameute, in the province of Quebec, a lot of members are former CAF members, and a lot of them leave the CAF because they were disappointed by the CAF, and they were disappointed by the values of the CAF. And I remember when I read an article in the Globe and Mail published in 2019, a very good one on the extremism within the CAF. I think it's maybe Dakoff wrote on a post that he was disappointed by the CAF because there's too much training on the snowflakes. He used the word the snowflakes instead of having trainings to be a soldier. So, and he said, I will, I will leave. It's no more an army. So a lot of these guys on Lameute are that kind of veteran. They are veteran, not because they are very old, because the CAF is no more a milieu where they are happy. CAF is no more, or was never, what they dreamed. They live in a phantasma. They think that the army is the place where they can be right-winger and extremist, but it's not the case. Sorry, guys, it's not the case. So I think that some of them maybe they are watching too much TV or Hollywood's movies, but they have an image of a soldier that is not accurate, and so they are disappointed. So the idea of including veterans could be important, because these persons were CAF members. They are no more, but they are in a certain way part of CAF because they are veterans. It's a family. We have to look at a family, a very large family. The ones who are actually members and the ones who were members, and they are wounded. In the eyes of a soldier today, these persons are wounded. They are brother in arms that falls. They are wounded. They are sick some way, or we should help them. So their perspective is different than ours. We are looking at them like insects or objects, or but I think that the soldier perspective is different. They look at them as failed soldier, but it's difficult to be a soldier. So that's just my point on the idea of a veteran. That's a good point.
Thanks for that, Marc. I'm going to ask you to respond to this next question because you referred to Duckhoff in that that response. And I first want to thank this poster who said, thank you for your time and the important work that you all do. We certainly appreciate that. But his first question is, has there been any movement in terms of determining the identity of Duckhoff, the man who alleged during his recruiting interview for the base that he was in the CAF?
I really don't know. Maybe somebody tried to find who is this guy, but I don't know.
Do you know?
No, I don't. I really don't know. Murray, do you know? No.
No. Okay.
No.
Okay.
David?
I don't know, but the what I know, and this is where I saw in the chat that Vice News got mentioned fairly often, and maybe Murray can chime in on this as well. But cases where, and this is a very thin line between crossing ethics lines and whatnot from a researcher perspective, but cases that we know about of people being outed for right-wing extremist views who are CAF members, at least the ones that I'm aware of. Sorry, an excited dog. Have been done through sleuthing by media experts. So, for example, Albid Nua of Ottawaffen out here out east was outed as, and his name was divulged. I'm sorry. Was divulged because of clever internet sleuthing. And I think that these types of extremists and these types of extremist movements, at least from a security and terrorism perspective, they're, as much as we'd like to label them as stupid or ignorant, they learn. They're adaptive, they're reactive, and I think that it's going to be harder and harder. So while this person hasn't been outed per se, it's not something that we as researchers would do. And if it is going to happen, I think it'll be the media. And I'm not saying this in a negative sort of way. But Murray, do you want to chime in on that? And once again, sorry for the dog barking.
No, the perils of doing panels from home. Yes, and actually, I did see the comment that went by earlier, and I was remiss in not giving a shout out to the excellent work that Vice News has done. But perhaps for an education purpose for the audience, Vice is not a daily news organization like the CBC, like CTV, like the Globe and Mail. And Vice is free to be able to do more investigative, long-term projects. They're able to drop people into stories and leave them there for 4, 5, 6 months. Now, that's not an excuse, but it's a structural explanation of how stuff gets done. And if you ask most journalists today, they would much prefer to be doing enterprise reporting that is similar to Vice than grinding out the sausages, as we call them, in the daily news world. And that's something that's a structural issue that has to be addressed with the media. But it also comes back to the point that I was making earlier about the actual dedication of editorial resources. And I think that most news organizations today are struggling to survive rather than actually just sitting down thinking, okay, what are some of the major issues that we have to cover? And that's something that has to change within the media. But that's about the only sort of like clarity that I can bring, other than thanks for reminding me I should have given them a shout out.
Thanks for that. I think the next question, I don't think any of us are sort of in a position to respond to that. And that's, would the CAF consider undergoing a stand down exercise similar to what the US Marines recently did? I think that's beyond our kin, if you will. The next one I think is really about the net widening that that David spoke about earlier on. So I think we'll move to the next one. Again, always happy to hear kind words. Thank you for your presentations about the presence of right-wing extremism in the military and its role in right-wing extremist groups. Maybe grasp the seriousness of the issues. I would also like to know if someone has made a reflection or is researching about the woke movement and the way both right-wing extremist groups and extremist left-wing groups and how they mutually feed each other's extremism. As a teacher, I'm preoccupied with the impact of the woke groups in schools and institutions, and with the possibility of these groups providing, without really meaning to, ideological weapons to right-wing extremist groups. David,
The
looks like you want
question,
to-
the person added further information about four questions down if you want to add that as well.
Oh,
Or I
yep,
can
I
read
see
it
it.
off.
Yep. So further, here's an example regarding my question. There are examples in Concordia University and Ottawa University related to teachers being fired or forced to provide public apologies due to the use of the N-word within the context of the course topic. Events like these might fuel the argumentative arsenal of right-wing extremist groups as justification for their actions.
I think I can answer this at length, but honestly, Barb, I think you are probably best positioned to answer this. It's something that Barb and I get asked a lot when we talk to strategic partners, when we speak to the media and particularly members of the public as well. There's always this it's one of these questions that guaranteed to come up. And there's actually the following question as well brings this up. There's a trend that right wing equals bad and left wing equals good. And the person who posed the question states that there seems to be danger of compromising the nonpartisan nature of the CAF. And this is probably why we get this very often. There's a concern that a myopic focus on right-wing extremism is part and parcel of a willful ignorance of the fact that there is left-wing violence and there is ideological left-wing violence and so on and so forth. However, the reason why we focus on right-wing violence, to be blunt, is that in our assessment as people who do this for a living, at least from the research side of things, the breadth, the number of incidents, and let alone national trends, but global trends indicates that right-wing extremism has a greater potential to incite violence, particularly mass casualty and other forms of violence, whereas left-wing violence tends to be, and I'm not saying that all the cases, tends to be reactionary very often to right-wing violence. And I can keep going on, but if you want to chime in and just give your 2 cents, Barb, it's probably, you could probably talk about it with a lot more depth than I.
Yeah, and you're right. It is a question that that we get quite often. And it sort of, it equates left wing and right wing. And I think, from the outset, we have to recognize that the right wing actors that we're talking about here, especially, the accelerationists and the patriot and military, as we mentioned, their ideologies are inherently violent. Their ideologies are inherently dangerous to the communities that they target. They're a rejection of core constitutional values, not even just, social, rainbows and uniforms values, but they're a rejection of our constitutional values. Most of what we see from the left, especially when whatever you define as the left, especially if we think about, the BLM movement and the anti-racist movement and the anti-fascist movement, those are groups that are committed to those constitutional ideals of inclusion and respect for diversity. So I think that that there's not an equivalency between the two. However, I will say that the right does in fact use those kinds of examples, exploits those kinds of examples that you've provided there to let, try to claim some legitimacy for their own sense of victimhood in particular, because that's essentially what it comes down to. It's a reactionary movement that feels like, white European males in particular have been if we want to use, one of the terms, the replaced through the Great Replacement, that they have been supplanted, that they've been disadvantaged. I mean, they've lost privilege, some, not entirely. They've lost some privilege, but they're certainly not disadvantaged as a class. And so I think for me, that's that's the key, is that that reactionary ethos that runs counter to core Canadian values. Okay. Just want to make sure we didn't miss any. What steps can serving leaders take to inoculate their soldiers, sailors, aviators? I like that inclusive list there, against right-wing extremist radicalization. I believe the ongoing small group ethics training, dialogue-based, not PowerPoint or DLN, is the most promising course of action, but I'm wondering if there's more research available on this. And you're absolutely right with that. I think it is. I mean, we've been doing, sort of more higher level training, and it has been largely, sort of this form, talking heads rather than the dialogue. But I think when it comes down to the unit level, that sort of thing, it absolutely has to be an ongoing dialogue, and not you set aside an hour, but it's part of the day-to-day. It's part of the engagement, reiterating those values that are meant to shape the Canadian military. So you're absolutely right. I mean, first of all, acknowledging and recognizing that that there is an issue, perhaps not widespread, but an issue that is of enough concern that we're building policy and practice around it. So yeah, I think that is absolutely the starting point. That small group, I think sort of the leadership needs to be formally educated, and allow that to trickle down then into the soldiers, sailors, and aviators across the board. So I thank you for that question. Another one, thank you, panelists, for your remarks. In addition to increasing screening processes for catching applicants with right-wing leanings, do you think there are any structures within the CAF that could contribute to or encourage the development of right-wing extremist ideologies? If so, how can we tackle this? And David, you've got your virtual hand up there.
Yeah. This is a good question, and it's one of these ones that I'm going to have to answer with again another lukewarm kind of broad placeholder answer, I suppose. Well, the first thing I want to address, though, before I give, I guess, the generic answer is something. This was an early discussion, actually, when we were starting to even conceive of and get the network off the ground, and it came up in our conversations with members of D&D and members of the CAF over a period of several months. But the idea of increasing or strengthening screening processes to weed out RWE applicants. I mean, I'm going to give, I guess, my informed opinion here, and I encourage other panelists to push back, or even people in chat to push back. But I don't think that's a panacea. I don't think that's going to weed out particularly the members who are joining from patriot movements, from militaristic or accelerationist RWE movements, who are joining with pre-established ideological worldviews. They're not going to walk into their interview and spout off their beliefs, right? They're going to willfully occlude them, and they're going to bend the and give the answers that they think the screening, the people screening or the test wants to hear. It'll probably do a better job of weeding out the individuals who might hold latent biases or latent RWE leanings. But in terms of catching hardcore members, I'm skeptical personally myself. In terms of the structures within this CAF itself, that's something we're interested in looking at. Too early for us to say with any authority. Again, Barb mentioned there's a great deal of research out from the United States, but as Canadians, we know that our culture and our cultural institutions are not completely analogous with the American context. So this is something on our radar, and that's the lukewarm answer that I was alluding to.
Well, and I think what we're getting to there is really this whole broader question of military culture and the extent to which military culture is seen from the outside by, you know, those who are seeking to recruit military personnel as something that is akin to, you know, again, this is the misperception of recruiters, that there's some synergy there between the military and the far right. But maybe I can throw that to Phil again, because again, this is something that he's been thinking a lot about is military culture and how it creates an environment, a climate in which right-wing extremism can thrive.
I think
Sorry
sorry
to put you on the spot there, Phil.
No, I think that, and I was just thinking about that. I think that there's more of a leaning toward the combat arms because the culture within the three elements are absolutely different. I mean, the dominant ethos that is present within combat arms is different than those that are at sea or those that are in the Air Force. So I think that I mean, if you want to look at some of the events that have occurred going back to the early 1990s, the majority of those who have engaged in any form of right-wing extremism were in the Army. It was land. There's only been very few that I can see, approximately 5 or so, that were actually in the Navy. So the majority are land-based. It's whether it's the reserves or the reg force. It seems more so geared toward reservists than regs, but I definitely feel that the culture within the within combat arms is more directed toward the, like Marc was sort of prevailing to, the GI Joe sort of type of attitude. So I think that's where it's at as far, and once in the military, these guys know how to navigate the system. They know how to hide behind the uniform. They know how to engage within the environment. It's identifying those individuals. What are the attributes and characteristics that would sort of lend somebody to engage in this sort of behavior? You know, acting out in a discriminatory manner, using language and so on is one thing, but actually wanting to hurt somebody is something different. So those are the people that I think need to be identified, and what characteristics sort of lend toward that type of behavior.
Murray, go ahead. Thanks, Phil.
Phil, I'd like to pick up on a point that you meant about combat arms, because if you're looking for ways to not to root out right-wing extremism, but this is just an observation of mine, and it was honed after 15 months of covering the Army and on the ground in Afghanistan in some pretty extreme conditions. I think that there needs to be, rather than focused on modular kind of courses that are being given in the Army, there needs to be a focus on social literacy and civics literacy. Mm-hmm. Because one of the things I used to face a lot of times, and again, this is a personal example, I would be riding in labs with a bunch of guys and gals who would be complaining about the media and about, oh, the media this and the media that. Now that's a perennial thing, regardless of where you go. But I used to laugh it off with them. But then if they kept kind of like needling away at me, the argument that used to shut them up was, I would say to them, okay, look, folks, you're over here fighting for the Afghans to have the right to be able to question their own government, to be able to hold their own leaders to account, and to be able to collectively set their own course for their country and for their families and everything else. I said, what you're over here fighting for is what I have to do pretty much every day, which is ask questions on behalf of those people or bring stories to light about individual circumstances. And it was remarkable how often when you sort of equated what the media did with the democratic foundation of the armed forces and how it is there to help preserve democracy, how the arguments evaporated like that. And what I've often reflected on, I didn't really reflect on fully until what Phil just said, was how that is not something that is considered within the framework or the mentality of combat arms. And perhaps a focus on that internally might make a difference.
That's a really good point, Murray. And actually, it was serendipitous that I was speaking with the Germans today because, I mean, that was something that they talked about, and that this is something that is as a regular part of not just, you know, recruits training, but yearly. You know, folks are introduced to that notion of civics literacy and the fact that you know the soldiers and the aviators and the sailors are also citizens of the country, and that they have a particular role, a very distinct role in, to the extent that they're in uniform, are always on display as a reflection of the nation. And so I think you're absolutely right to be reminded of that, and sort of leads to the next question, which is about you know, what other countries, other NATO countries are doing. And I'm sorry, I had a message in the chat here that Yannick Villiers-Lepage has left. We're just collaborating with him on a project looking at some of our NATO partners and what they are doing in this context. And that's one of the sub projects D&D have asked us to look at with respect to Germany in terms of the reporting mechanism that they have in place and have had in place for a very long time, but also their responses to right-wing extremism within the military. And I know that there are efforts afoot in other countries, Australia, the UK, for example, that we can also look to. Dave, did you want to add there? I saw you had your virtual hand up there. No, okay.
No, it was everything that I wanted to bring up was brought up.
Okay. The next question, I have no idea. I don't know if anyone else on the panel does. I just lost it. Where'd it go? Oh, would the 1984 storming of the Quebec National Assembly by Denis Lortie also be considered extremism? How would it be categorized? And I don't know enough details of that case to even guess. Never mind, provide an informed response. No hands up. Okay, sorry about that.
Marc can answer it. He just indicated interest.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I would say that Denis Lortie, it can be considered a lone wolf and a psychiatric case at the same time. But saying that consider him as an extremist, maybe an exaggeration, is more a psychiatric or a lone wolf. He talked about some political ideology a little bit, but most of his discourse were distress more than politics. I read a book on him, and my opinion is this guy was more disturbed than an activist.
Well, it's piqued my interest anyway. I'll have to do a little digging there, do a little research. It's interesting how, you know, we interpret historical events through contemporary lenses. I mean, even to think about the Marc Le Pen attack at the École Polytechnique, you know, we recognize that as, you know, violence against feminists, but we didn't understand it as misogynistic violence as we do.
But Lortie was against the government. Mm-hmm. He wanted to kill René Lévesque. Yep. And so that's a political aspect.
Mhm.
but most of his discourse are disarticulate.
Okay, thanks for that. What sort of training regime is available for the military to instruct NCMs, NCOs, and officers of the differences between what language constitutes right-wing extremism and acceptable political debate? I don't know to what extent, no idea to what extent internally there's training around this. This is something I don't think that I've talked about in the trainings that I've provided within DND, but it's certainly something that I talk about in other contexts when we're talking about, I mean, one of the first steps to being able to effectively challenge and counter, whether through legal means or otherwise, legal means or training or that sort of thing, is that we need to understand those things that I talked about earlier on and that David alluded to as well, in terms of, you know, the very concrete definitions of what constitutes hate speech that have been delivered by the courts. So I don't know that there's training like that internally, but you know, if there's interest at, you know, local levels, I'm happy to develop some of that for you. It keeps moving as questions come in. The differences in experiences I've seen across the country with regards to reg forces, res forces, comes down to leadership within each of the units. How should the forces address the problems with the lack of experienced, competent leaders in reserves versus the reg force, and not having, you know, much sense at all of how you know, appointments are made at the military? Again, I'm not even going to hazard a guess there. I don't know if Marc or Murray, you have anything to offer on that? No.
Philip, maybe.
No. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, Marc.
Yeah, that's a difficult question, and it's sensitive within the forces when you are talking about the reserve and the regular. We cannot give an answer to this question. It would need a lot of research.
Yeah. Okay. So, okay, that was that question. Do any members of the panel identify as conservative or right wing? More moderately, obviously. Not me.
Politically apathetic. Nonpartisan.
I think what you're getting, you know, getting at there is our, you know, inherent bias. I'm trying to think if I know any sort of you know, conservatives who work in the field. Bound to be some, but not sure who they might be.
The
Well,
problem is, oh, sorry, Marc, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, as a journalist, that at one point or another in my career, I have been accused of being conservative. I've been accused of being a Democrat. I have been accused of being a liberal. I have been accused of being a member of the Rhino Party, and my answer is normally the same. Of course, like anyone, I have my own political views, but publicly and professionally, you know, I'm for good government, and when I see it, I will let you know. And I think that I personally think that that is the way that most people who are in the public domain should behave. This is just a personal view, which is, you know, basically you're there for the people. And you know, is that a right, left? No, it's you know, it's a matter of civics. So, and just to address one of the comments that one of the folks just made about some of the basic training, it includes civics literacy, you know, etc. Yes, I'm aware that there is that, but I would suggest perhaps some of the course modules, at least from my experience, need to be refined when it comes to civics and social. But I respect the fact, and thanks for pointing that out.
And the last question we have in the Q&A is, do you see a need perhaps in the future for a similar awareness of possible right-wing extremist members in policing with the culture of it's cool to hate police and the contributions of media to that end. Is this a risk? Training, weapons, knowledge also pose a risk. Yeah, I mean, there's been more research again in the US around engagement of policing with right-wing extremism. I mean, there was a period in history when they were inextricable, that, you know, it was almost required that to join certain police, sheriff's departments in particular in the South in the US, you had to be a member of the KKK. So, you know, there's that history. Not to say that police are KKK by any stretch, but in some respects, almost as much, if not more. You know, I think the movement. Well, I shouldn't say that. I think the movement is very split on its perception. The far right movement is perceptions of police. You know, on the one hand, they certainly like to have their support. Again, as you suggest, they also, you know, like to have the kind of training that they have access to. But there's also a lot of resistance and a lot of hostility towards the police on the part of the far right. They often see them, especially in the context of, you know, policing their rallies, that sort of thing. They actually see them as the enemy. Keep in mind that, you know, not just on the far left, but on the far right rather, there is a strong contingency of a contingent of anti-statist and anti-authority actors. So that, you know, it's a real ambivalent, at best ambivalent relationship between the movement and law enforcement. But in the Canadian context, absolute radio silence. You know, not even, I think, in the media have we seen much conversation about that. David, I think you might have had something to add.
Yeah, just a little bit of promotion, I guess, for one of my graduate students. So there's one of my master's students within the next 6 months is going to be publishing a thesis on this, using statistical analyses of open source data on how police respond to right-wing extremist calls and events. So it's as Barb said, there's really not much there, but this is like one tiny step in that direction, and it's something that is increasingly ending up on people's radars, particularly again with what's happening in the world. So I suspect that there will be a slow but growing body of literature on this. And if you are interested in this, at least in some of that empirical data and whatnot, when my student publishes her thesis, I will send me an email and I'll put you, I'll send it your way personally when it's published. So.
Thanks. Well, that looks to be all the questions we have in the Q&A. I think that was a pretty active and lively round of questions. Really appreciate it. I'm really glad. I mean, we put together a good panel. We were only, you know, having to pass on a couple of questions out of all of those. So it's a good sign of the expertise that we brought together here. So I want to thank those of you who joined us. And let's see, I think, how many do we still have? We still have almost 50 of you hanging on at the end here. So that's really wonderful. I really appreciate the questions and the interest in the work that we're doing. And I want to thank the panelists and Marc and Murray in particular for sharing your time with us today as well, and rounding us out. As we all know, there are very few of us working in this field. So, you know, I think it's important that we're able to share the stage, if you will, and share the conversations. And I hope that this is truly just the beginning of that conversation for us and, you know, for members, some of the attendees who might also be interested. You know, don't hesitate to reach out. I think that Brad put in the chat earlier on the URL for the network website. So, you know, don't hesitate to go there and to seek us out as well. So much appreciated. And I think that's a wrap for us. So thank you all. Does anyone have any? Oh, yep. Marc?
No, just goodbye.
Just waving. Wasn't a hand up, it was just a wave. Okay. We need jazz hands up there somewhere. Great. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Stay safe. Stay well. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Tracy left us. That was a lot of questions.
I was, while it was going on, I was getting hit with emails and text messages. How do I join? How do I join? How do we get in? And I had to let them know that we're going to have a recording. It will be available. Don't worry.
We should stop recording.
Yeah.
Oh, yep,
Yeah.
yep.